Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday, and welcome to today's edition of FreightWaves Now. I'm Kaylee Nix here with my co-host, lead economist Anthony Smith.
That's right, and today it's Friday, and we have a jam-packed show coming up. We'll tell you all about a startup that was unable to pay its employees for a month, and we'll tell you why the DOE benchmark diesel price won't be released this week. But first, our top story today hits on how a record number of new trucking operations authorities were applied for and granted, and some of those operations already being shut down. We bring out Rachel Premack now for those numbers. Rachel, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And this story is really, really interesting. It's coming in your recent edition of Modes that just went out this week. And we saw kind of this record number of authorities being applied for and granted by the FMCSA. And now we're seeing all of these small business truckers suddenly going out of business, which we talked about would happen back when kind of the freight downturn started. But let's get into those numbers a little bit first off, kind of set the scene for us, what's going on in the broader scope right now, these small business truckers.
Right. So in May, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration reported that more than 5,000 trucking companies saw their operating authority revoked. The total was actually 9,300, but about 4,000 of that was attributed to lack of process designated agents, kind of an aberration. But even putting aside that 4,000, we're left with more than 5,000 companies that saw their operating authority revoked. And this is a record on the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's record.
And Rachel, when you look at these numbers, were there any clear signs or causes for any particular of these shutdowns for some of these owner-operators?
Right. So the most likely cause of these operating authorities getting revoked, just kind of what we've been talking about the last few months, diesel is way up, spot rates have crashed. Avery Weiss of FTR and others I spoke to believe that most of these trucking companies that lost their authorities were most likely owner-operators, just one-person trucking companies. Many of them maybe leased their truck back to a large carrier or joined a large carrier as employees, or maybe even just got out of the industry entirely. But the point is that a record number of trucking companies were created the past 2 years, and now we're going to see kind of a pullback in those companies.
Rachel, I want to kind of get your speculative thoughts on something that I've kind of noticed. We've seen kind of this, obviously we had the glut of influx of new trucking companies and new operating authorities applied for, and that was part of the pandemic. And within that pandemic, we saw a lot of these smaller companies also applying for paycheck protection loans. And then now we're starting to see PPP fraud come out of this too. Do you think that there could possibly be any connection between now the pullback and the loss of some of these operating authorities, and maybe could we be seeing a connection between mishandling funds of PPP loans?
That's a really interesting question, not something I've looked into, but I'm sure that, it's interesting because I think a lot of these companies, the ones who are most at risk now, probably were created after the PPP loans, although that is a really interesting question. My understanding is that a lot of the companies that are most at risk now probably were created in late 2020 or throughout 2021, kind of chasing those super high spot rates. And unfortunately, a lot of those companies don't have the same kind of business acumen that comes from surviving dip after upswing after, kind of the business cycles of trucking where it's always on the up or the down. A lot of those small businesses that were just newly created probably don't have that same kind of business acumen and savings and all of that. But the larger issue is that a lot of these companies probably bought or leased a truck, probably most of these companies bought a truck right when used truck prices were like 2 to 3 times what they would normally be. So these companies have not a ton of savings. They have increased costs because they bought incredibly expensive equipment, and they don't kind of have that, acumen that comes from years and years of running your own business. So the PPP part is definitely interesting. I'm sure that's part of it, but it seems like the biggest uh, drive in these authorities getting revoked is just they started a year or two ago, and now they're like, well, I can't run this anymore. It's too expensive, and rates aren't what they used to be.
Rachel, when I think of this, I'm always going to take it back to sports and athletics. And I know, like, sometimes when I would play football, there would be new people on the team, and after a really rough practice or something that was really a difficult workout, you could see a look in their eyes and just know they're not coming back tomorrow. When you look at this situation, do you see this as a permanent fall off for some of these individuals or a potential for them to get absorbed by some larger operations?
Yeah, exactly. So most of these, especially the one-person owner-operators, most of them are probably going to be joining a larger company just as employees. Some of them are leasing their truck back, so they're still, on their own, but they at least have the opportunity to be part of that larger carrier where they can get, some discount on diesel. They can, kind of benefit from being part of their larger network. But we'll have to see, because I do believe that most of these that are getting revoked right now are smaller, one person. But I think once we see the larger carriers of several dozen or several hundred drivers, it will be interesting to see what happens with those.
So when we look to support groups or groups that are really passionate about supporting our owner-operators, we always, of course, talk about OOIDA first and foremost. And they've come on the last month and they've kind of been like, okay, we are seeing this kind of, I'm almost going to call it a mass exodus, but it's not really that. It's just kind of this leaving of all of these drivers, right? And they're like, we're trying to help support this. We're trying to help support our independent owner-operators still. And they, of course, try to do that through legislation. Do you think that there is anything that's going on in government right now that could kind of help stop or stymie the sudden loss of all of these smaller companies?
It's hard to say. The most kind of promising, trucker first law I can think of is Andy Levin's bill to secure overtime pay for truck drivers. But of course, that's more on the employee side rather than the small business owner side. It's hard to say. There are several kind of promising initiatives with increasing truck parking and there's a few others, but the truck parking is the first that comes to mind. And I think that could definitely make life a bit easier for drivers. Whether those initiatives will be completed in time for, this current downswing is probably unlikely, but, it's good to kind of have this momentum going to make the job a little bit easier going forward.
And then when we're talking about legislation, of course, what's kind of on the front mind of some of these smaller independent contractors for folks, especially out in the state of California, is the AB5 legislation, which the Supreme Court either it's got to take up today or tomorrow. We got 2 days left before they make a decision on this. If the Supreme Court decides to strike down AB5, then it will, of course, immediately go into effect in the state of California. It's a state law, not a federal law, but a ton of owner-operators run in California, especially at the ports running drayage there. Do you think that legislation like AB5 could potentially have the threat to now make this glut of drivers even worse, as we see independent contractors who may have been running in California now trying to get rid of their authority too, or join these larger fleets just so that they can keep working?
Yeah, so California is definitely an interesting state for owner operators and trucking companies as a whole because they have a slew of kind of environmental laws. The diesel in California, I think I saw reports of $10 a gallon for diesel in California. So it really remains to be seen how AB5 could affect all of that. But I will definitely be following along to learn more about that.
And Rachel, before we let you go, anything around this story that's maybe an underlying trend that isn't really being spoken about enough, or are there any other stories in the supply chain that you're looking at now that you can kind of preview for us?
Yeah, I mean, kind of one of my favorite kind of data points from this story that I just pulled up here from July 2020 to, right now, almost 195,000 new carriers entered the market. and 70% of those carriers were just one truck. The previous kind of 23-month record that you could really compare that to just saw 86,000 new carriers. So it's really hard to overemphasize just how many new owner operators entered the market the past few years. And with diesel way up, equipment costs up, insurance, tires, all of these things just being more expensive today, along with spot rates being way down, it's really it's going to be a really painful and difficult time for a lot of small businesses out there.
100%, Rachel. Thank you for joining us today for today's top story. For your Modes newsletter, if folks want to subscribe to that, where can they go to do that?
You can just go to freightwaves.com/modes, or if you follow me on Twitter at RRPRE, I don't know why I just forgot my handle, but RRPRE, you can find kind of my link there. I'm on LinkedIn, but yeah, freightwaves.com/modes is the best, easiest kind of way to do that.
All right, Rachel, thank you for being here. Have a great weekend. Right now, we're going to head over to the wall. We've got our first carrier update this morning, and we've got Thomas Wasson in with us for Donnie Gilbert today. Guys, take it away.